Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me. I've got, I think, about 9 or 10 slides here that I'm going to talk through kind of erratically. There's a few major subjects that I haven't got a slide on, but I hope we might be able to talk about anyway, either in the course of the next session or via someone deciding to interrupt me when they think they've missed out something substantial. I'm hoping to get as many business cards as I can from people here. However, I don't carry business cards myself. The bottom left-hand corner of this slide is my equivalent of a business card. So, please, kind of have a look at that, write it down, get in touch with me. And so, some people have read my book, some haven't. But this is basically the story of how cybernetics turned my life around and changed me from a out-of-work economist into a non-fiction author, and took me even into Whitehall to start talking to them about questions of information and organisation. One piece of advice I can give that I wish someone had given me is that if you ever find yourself being invited to number 10 Downing Street, remember that the selfie camera on your phone is a mirror image, or you will have a picture of yourself to send to your family WhatsApp group outside 01 Downing Street. So anyway, how did this all happen? Well, we got two little animals up there which kind of bookend the story. My book, The Unaccountability Machine, opens with an anecdote that seemed extremely funny to me when I first heard it, but significantly less so and more disturbing after having to repeat it on multiple times on every publicity appearance I did for the next 2 years. It's a story about the airline KLM and 400 Chinese banded ground squirrels. For those who didn't read the book, I'll just keep this briefly. It was 1999. There was a bit of a craze in Europe for the ground squirrel as a pet. A cargo of 400 of them arrived in Schiphol Airport from a breeder in Beijing, bound for a pet retailer in Athens. But they didn't have the right paperwork, and the European Union biosecurity laws are quite strict. There was no way that those could be sent on within the European Union without the correct veterinary tests. There was no address to send them back to, though. So they were kind of stuck there in the animal hotel, as it is called, in Schiphol Airport. Can't send them on, can't send them back, can't really keep them in Schiphol Airport for the rest of their lives, particularly as 3 or 4 of them had already escaped. What do you do with 396 squirrels? It is a difficult challenge, but you have to think that there is a better solution than the one that KLM actually decided on, which was to throw all of them into an industrial shredder. Yeah, I have told this story on many occasions. Everyone always goes, those poor squirrels, how can you make light of their death? With one exception, when I gave a presentation at the management offsite for a prominent hedge fund, where the view in the room was, who cares, they were only squirrels. Which tells you something about the culture of quantitative finance. This turned into a scandal. The reason I know about this is that the press release that KLM later put out, apologising for it, is still studied in business schools as an example of crisis PR. They apologised for it. The board said that they never meant to do this. And I, for one, believe them. Nobody goes into the airline game because that's what they want to do. However, they had created a system in which this would inevitably happen. Because I kind of played a trick there. This is non-fiction writing tricks. I started the story in medias res because, of course, the beginning of this story isn't when the plane lands in Amsterdam. The beginning of this story is when the plane took off in China without the correct paperwork having been filed in order to load those signals through. KLM had made, consciously or by ignorance, a decision that the control on the veterinary paperwork of imported small rodents as pets was going to be carried out in Amsterdam at a point where there was no realistic alternative except the destruction of the animals, rather than taking responsibility for making the checks in Beijing when the animals were loaded onto the aeroplanes. This was a system failure, but it was a kind of interesting kind of system failure because everyone in the management chain, from the executives at KLM to the civil servants at the Dutch Agriculture Ministry to the people in Brussels who drew up the European biosecurity standards, nobody really went into a room and said, we have to be prepared to commit squirrelcide on a scale never seen before in Europe. Nobody wanted to own the consequences of that decision, and so they'd created a system in which rodent destruction was inevitable, but where no individual human being could have that decision attributed to them. And it all worked fine for them for a while until something came along which was well outside the scale that they'd planned for, and the system collapsed. What had effectively happened is that the accountability for those decisions to destroy animals had been diverted into what I kind of call an accountability sink made out of European legislation and company policy, and it just built up there until the reservoir broke down and all of that accountability came flooding out back to the management of KLM, who had to answer questions in the Dutch Houses of Parliament. They very nearly came close to just shutting down imports of live animals into Schiphol Airport altogether. I kind of use this in my book as a sort of metaphor for what's happened in society and governance overall. That in more and more areas of public life, people have created these decisions with no human owner. They've done so in a way which either intentionally or unintentionally obscures or eliminates the relationships of feedback and response that we call accountability, and that from time to time and with increasing frequency, those accountability sinks were breaking down, and we were seeing public responses that just really kind of had the content that all of the decisions seemed intolerable to them, and they had no way of carrying out kind of high bandwidth feedback within the system. This was my theory of populist politics, Trumpism, Brexit, and kind of similar movements, that they were a response to the breaking down of a system which had structurally removed the relationships of accountability which were the basis for popular consent. And so, I wrote about that. And the great thing about writing books is that people read them who you would never have met otherwise. And so I kind of put this thing out, and I started getting emails and messages and invitations, a lot of them coming from people in public policy who recognized that there was a problem here, but didn't know how to do anything about it. And so people started asking me, how can we build accountability back into our system? And when you start getting a challenge like that, you start realizing that the only response you can give is, are you sure you want to do that? These systems were not built up purely out of cowardice on the part of people who wanted to avoid being held accountable for their decisions. For the most part, these systems were being built because they were necessary variety amplifiers in the system. There is no way in the current system of government for these decisions to be taken individually by human beings who can, in a way that renders those human beings accountable for them. The kind of metaphor I ended up using is that here we have a paper cup. This was not produced by an artisanal origami kind of craftsperson. It's the output of a paper cup making machine. There is no human being in the world who would say that they made that cup. If the operator of the machine said it, you'd think they were joking. Sorry.
Can you just clarify something? You said it was a variety amplifier for government.
Yeah.
I would argue that what we're talking about here is variety differential, and that as a matter of outcome, variety attenuation of the audience that's watching government behaviour works in the same way. But I would claim that what you're saying when you use the word unaccountability machine is that they're using the variety sink as an attenuator on public variety to question government, rather than expanding government's variety to deal with the complexity it creates.
Fair point, well made. I think it's a bit of both. To be honest, I have never, and it is honestly not for want of trying, really been able to get clear about whether there is a principled distinction between amplifying the variety of the controller and attenuating the variety of the system. In this case, I'm using variety amplifier just in a very, very simple sense that once you've set a policy, you don't need to make every individual decision under that policy one at a time. But I see the point you're making there about reducing the kind of resolution and granularity with which Westminster... Can I park that one for a slide? Because a point I think very similar to the one that you're making there becomes very important in one slide's time. So you have these systems in which people have made an industrial decision-making machine. And just as the operator of an industrial cup-making machine doesn't feel like they made the cups, when someone goes from being a decision maker to being the operator of an industrial decision-making machine, their relationship to those decisions changes. And so it's not just as simple as going, I mean, I wish it was, and when I started writing the book, I had dreams of myself doing this, as going into a government department and saying, shame on you for avoiding accountability. You must be accountable for these decisions, because there's actually a fact here. There's actually a fact about the way that the system of control is structured. It is not structured in such a way that the normal everyday language meaning of accountability is applicable to these concepts. That's a relationship which has to hold really between human beings. If you're applying accountability to decisions made by a system, for choice, I would abandon the word. I don't think it's politically or kind of managerially possible to abandon the word, for purposes of public discussion, but for choice, I would prefer to talk about missing feedback links, or, as my friend Scott made, to talk about the resolution at which the system is applied. So anyway, I should get on with slides, but I want to talk about the snail first, because the snail is the other end of my journey through government. This is the little Whirlpool ramshorn snail. I think I've got it the right way around. It might be the ramshorn Whirlpool snail. It's called little because it's little. It's Whirlpool because its shell is shaped like a whirlpool. Ramshorn because its shell is also shaped like a ram's horn. And snail, yes, its shell is shaped like a snail. Why it has three names that mean basically the same thing, I don't know. But this poor little mollusk has a hard time of it. It is endangered. In fact, there are only 2 colonies of little Whirlpool ramshorn snails in the UK, both of which are extremely inconveniently located for the planning industry. There is one colony in Norfolk which has successfully prevented the widening of a road there and thus is probably indirectly responsible for dozens of road deaths. This snail has killed more people than in England than many much larger animals. The other colony is the one I'm interested in because it is in northwest Sussex, in wetlands near the River Arun, and it was the endangerment status of this snail which led to the creation of something called the North Sussex Water Neutrality Zone. And water neutrality zone means you can't build anything which increases the net amount of water being taken out of the River Arun and its surrounding aquifer in that area, which means effectively that you can't build anything at all. So something like 60,000 houses worth of housing development on the outskirts of Horsham and Crawley, in the London commuter belt, just where people and the government wants to build loads of houses, have been stalled for the best part of a decade because of the neutrality zone. And the neutrality zone is a bit of an interlocking management problem between different agencies. The Natural England have responsibility for the snails. They care about them because they are endangered snails and they have considerable powers. The Environment Agency has to take into account their recommendations. As well as taking into account Natural England's recommendations, the Environment Agency has to have regard to the water table in that area, because at the end of the day, nobody really benefits from building a housing estate where the toilets won't flush because there isn't enough water. Nobody at all benefits if a giant sinkhole appears on the outskirts of Crawley because too much water has been taken out of a fairly delicate chalk aquifer structure. The fact that this little snail is dying because its environment is drying out, it's bad for the snails, but it's also a very bad indicator for the overall state of the kind of water table in that part of the country. Southern Water, the local utility, had no incentive to do anything other than absolutely shut up like a clam, like a snail, and say that there was no problem, that everyone was being dumb, and there was certainly no need for them to change anything that they did. And the developers and the local governments felt that they were at an impasse. This impasse lasted for 6 or 7 years, but this is actually a good story about British governance, because earlier this year, the DEFRA Water Delivery Task Force, and I mean, if you hear the name Water Delivery Task Force, you think, never in my life have I heard a name that sounds less like it's going to deliver anything. But they did. Fair dues to the guys. They did what needed to be done, which was to get all of the parties together in a room, to get them talking to each other via local high bandwidth communication rather than through emails with an eye on future litigation, one of the lowest bandwidth communication channels you can think of. They got them to ask and answer the questions that you can't answer over email with a view on future litigation. Questions like, how much of what you're asking for is real and how much is bullshit? Questions like, what could you live with if you couldn't get everything you wanted? How much of this is your margin of conservatism and how much of this do we have to work with? And it turned out that in that environment, Natural England admitted that there were other things you can do to protect the snails. The Environment Agency admitted that it really had few concerns about the water table, but it felt like it was downside risk only for them, and they were happy to go along with what Natural England said. Southern Water agreed that they had negotiated their river extraction permits when a nearby reservoir was being repaired, and that now the repairs were finished, they could hand them back, and between them, they organised some further changes to sluices and local waterways. They made some adjustments to the reservoir. Southern Water handed back some permits, and between them, National England and the Environment Agency agreed that the water neutrality zone was now something that could be dropped and things could be handled kind of in a less drastic fashion. And in May, I think it was, construction began on 20,000 houses on the outskirts of Horsham. And this is a very cybernetic kind of case study, because what we had here was, firstly, there was not enough bandwidth in the communication channels for the information to be processed, but equally importantly, things had to be solved by DEFRA and central government, something from outside the local system, reminding the kind of state bodies of the higher level of priorities, because National England in this context only cared about snails, and the Environment Agency only cared about the water table. Southern Water cared about whatever water utilities care about. You would like to say profits, but as Stafford Beer said, you cannot say that something has a purpose that it consistently fails to achieve. Everyone knew that there was a problem. Everyone knew that it wasn't really a problem for them, and so someone had to step in who was capable of representing the wider problem and who had a scheme in which the metasystemic language could be used. I kind of think that lots of the problems that we have related to construction, planning and growth are basically cybernetic problems. The problem that you have in talking to people in government about their problems in this area is that it's kind of like the old problem with being Clark's chief salesperson for sub-Saharan Africa. In principle, it's a great job because you've got 200 million people there who need shoes. The only problem is always that they didn't want shoes. When you're trying to sell cybernetics to the government, it's kind of similar. They need it, they don't know that they need it. We have a lot of problems here. Basically, when you get into government and you start talking to policy people, you find that the homeostatic forces are incredibly strong. The tendency to go back to doing things how they've always done them is incredibly strong. The resistance to change is almost total. I've got a theory about this that I kind of like to test out with people, which is that when you are looking at an organisation which has been in place for a long time, then you're looking at something which has survived. If it has survived, then either it has been very lucky with every existential risk it has faced, or it has not faced many existential risks. From the meaning of the words very lucky, it is more likely that this thing has avoided existential risks. If it has avoided existential risks, then either it has been very lucky in not having an environment which has posed it with many existential challenges, or it has intentionally avoided the taking of existential risks. By this kind of argument, I end up concluding that when you're dealing with something which has been around for a long time, you are very likely to be dealing with an organisation that has developed strong internal norms against taking risks. And one of the ways in which you can reinforce norms against taking risks is to reinforce norms against changing anything. This is why I think civil service organisations in particular tend to get more set in their ways the longer that they have gone on. So kind of one of the recommendations I've always made is new problem deserves at least thinking about a new team, because it's just kind of evolution. You might want to tell the civil service to act like a startup, but if there ever were public sector organisations which acted like startups, the likelihood is that they did what 90% of startups do and disappeared, which is why we don't see them today. The civil service that we have is the civil service that has survived for over 100 years, which is why it doesn't act like a startup. It is therefore, to my mind, a bit of a losing game to try to make big changes and try to rationally redesign public sector organisations so as to meet what you might regard as a sensible or even a viable design. Which sounds like a bit of a counsel of despair, but I think it's not as bad as that, because a lot of the time when you're talking to people addressing these problems, you're doing emergency medicine rather than brain surgery. The problem is not necessarily that there is some complex misalignment of the information architecture. The problem is that people who should be talking to each other are not. Or the problem is that an extremely important type of information from the ground is not able to make its way into where decisions are made in time. So, as I say, I use the analogy of emergency medicine. A patient might have all sorts of things wrong with their endocrine system, they might have congestive heart failure, they might have a tumour. But if there is blood gushing out of any part of your patient when you reach them, you're probably going to be best off dealing with that, or you won't get a chance to treat anything else that's wrong with them. Just one kind of bullet at the end of that slide I'd like to emphasise, which is that one of the key axioms of management from Stafford Beer is that translation and transduction are incredibly important when information crosses over boundaries. In a lot of government organisations, there is indeed a problem that no effort is made to ensure that signals are transmitted. However, it's considerably worse than that in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, you get people who communicate with each other in the shadow of the law, in the knowledge that everything they say could be brought up and used against them at some future date. That means that the information attenuation at the organisational boundaries becomes complete, and complete attenuation, I'm increasingly believing, is not even the worst case. You can certainly get situations in which negative amounts of information is communicated because people are behaving strategically and trying to communicate what they think will cause other people to act in a way that is favourable to them, rather than anything which has any connection to the underlying ground truth. How did we get to this kind of place? I've got a theory about this, and it's a theory about the historical development of economics. You knew it was going to end up being the fault of economists. Everything is. Interesting historical development. My kind of little rogues gallery up there. You might recognise the people on the second line. We've got Claude Shannon, Norbert Wiener, and Stafford Beer. On the top line, I have got F.A. Hayek and Ronald Coase. Leading to the guy there, clipped from a CNN appearance, is Bill Niskanen, who is one of the founders of public choice economics and who has the Niskanen Centre at Johns Hopkins University, where I spent a year, named after him. Coase and Hayek are really interesting because they are dealing with recognisably cybernetic questions in the 1930s. So we have Hayek talking about the socialist calculation problem, talking about the market as a processor of information, and addressing all of these questions in the late 20s and early 1930s. Ronald Coase, talking about the theory of the firm, makes the statement, solving a problem which had really puzzled economists for the preceding couple of decades of why companies exist. Coase says that companies exist because of the difference in efficiency between communication within a firm to organise production and the communication between economic entities in the market. And these are really interesting ideas that they're playing around with, but here's the problem. Those guys are in black and white because they were writing in the 1930s. Almost all of the important ideas of economics of information were traceable back to things that people were writing before Kurt Gödel, before the Alan Turing and the concept of a Turing machine, certainly before Shannon and Wiener and rigorous mathematical information theory. So one of the things that's happened here is that Hayek and Coase are revered by modern economists, despite the fact that what they wrote looks nothing like modern economics at all. Coase didn't even have a mathematics qualification. He was a lawyer by training. They wrote this way because there was no mathematically rigorous concept of information theory when the foundational ideas of public choice economics and information economics were being developed. Which means that by the time you get to public choice economics in its 1970s incarnation and the application of economic theory to questions of governance and management in the state, the economists have no reason to look at Stafford Beer or Claude Shannon because they think that the problem of information was solved in the 1930s. They have no particular relationship to the mathematics of information theory. They've gone another way after the war into dynamic programming. And so, when Bill Niskanen and Anthony Downs and all of those guys were putting together public choice economics, they start thinking about information as a concept that basically means transaction costs. They start thinking about Coase and the boundary of the firm as being about the difference between internal and external transaction costs. They're looking at a dumbed down concept of information and bandwidth because they are still working in the Chicago price theory tradition in which all information is price and quantity. So you've got a channel which Hayek showed can carry a surprising amount of information across a market, but it's a channel with fixed bandwidth. It's a channel in which really everything has to be a commodity. And this is a big problem in terms of the policy recommendations they later make. Right. Brief primer on public choice economics. This is my distillation when challenged by someone at the Niskanen Institute to explain what the hell I was talking about here. I would say that these three axioms are really what drives most of what public choice economists say about governance and management. Incentives matter, opportunity costs need to be taken into account, and everything has to be judged in general equilibrium. All, perfectly reasonable and rational points. You can get a lot of juice out of this orange in terms of actionable policy advice. The trouble is that it works best when you are dealing with a state that is mainly involved in procuring commodities. When you are dealing with a government department which employs janitors and road menders and is building things which are commodities that are pretty well defined by price and quantity, it works. You start advising people to get those things out of the state, to restrict itself to policy rather than delivery, and you get the new public management. The motto of the new public management was that the state needs to be steering, not rowing. Which, by the way, kind of just does indicate that whoever coined that never rowed in their life. Because, you know, you steer a boat by rowing it. You steer a rowing boat by rowing it. That's how you steer the boat. It is often worth taking metaphors seriously because they often do actually lead you to the central kind of thing that's being missed. New public management outsourced huge amounts of the functions of the state. And this is outsourcing and really transferring managerial capacity out of the state. Mariana Mazzucato has a great book about the government use of management consultants, in which she points out that however much you think the state makes use of management consultancy, it's actually a lot more, because things like the outsourcing of social care and catering also need to be seen as a form of management consulting. When Sodexo takes over the catering contract at a hospital, the people who are actually boiling the eggs are still the same people, by and large, doing the same job for the same or a little bit less money. What has actually been outsourced is the management of the catering. And so you get the state, again, I seem to be fated into unpleasant animal metaphors, but this one is not even mine. This is Stafford Beer, the decerebrate cat, which is the feline half of horrible neurobiology experiments, which has had the connection cut between its cerebellum and the rest of its brain. Stafford Beer said that the decerebrate cat is capable of eating, it is capable of grooming itself, it will survive as long as it is kept in an environment like a laboratory where there are no new external stimuluses that it has to deal with, because what it has lost is the capacity for purposive action. That's kind of what happened to the state from the 1970s onwards. The capacity to make decisions and process information kept on being reduced with greater outsourcing, greater public-private partnerships, and the new public management. The world got more and more complicated. And so you got into this situation where an outsourcing model that had been developed by people who thought purely in terms of commodities and in large part for the outsourcing of purchases of commodities was being applied to complicated functions like management consulting contracts. A management consulting contract is incredibly difficult thing to agree, because if you knew how to specify the contract, you would know what the problem was and you wouldn't need the service. This is the situation that the state put itself in, with basically a complete undersupply of capacity at the centre. When you have got an undersupply of capacity at the centre, what do? You start to, well, you do two things. You can only do one of two things. You can make yourself smarter, or you can make the world simpler. You can't make yourself smarter because that costs money, and it costs even more money if you do it by a management consulting contract, and it costs even more money if you do it by a management consulting contract that you agreed at an upfront discount rate, but with provision for any changes to the contract to be obviously paid for at standard hourly rates, which is simply the most profitable way. I don't know why I'm giving commercial advice here, but if you're dealing with a government organisation, that is definitely the way to structure things. Cheap upfront price, any variations at the standard hourly rate. Mariana Mazzucato has been on to change this for 2 years, but so far she's had no success, so this scam is still open. You can't make...
We're saying that the digital transformation industry is mainly good at transforming the budget.
Well, yeah, I mean,
Whilst at the same time, you've shown that you've cut headcount in central government, which must therefore be cheaper.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Sort of big IT projects have this exact kind of issue that the capacity there isn't there to manage them, and it's very difficult to buy that capacity because it's fundamentally not a commodity, and the entire purchasing model is set up to deal in commodities. You can't make yourself smarter, so what you do is you make the world simpler. So exactly, this is the bit at which I said it would be good there. You make the world simpler, which is to say you reduce the level of granularity with which the state views the world. You create policies which treat things as undifferentiated representatives of whatever bucket the policy puts them into. Because you've done that, you've made an industrial decision-making machine. Because you've done that, you no longer feel any connection with or ownership of the decisions. Because of that, it becomes psychologically intolerable and probably operationally damaging for you to have feedback links of the sort that we normally call accountability. And so you develop a state system which is set up to treat people in a way that they don't like, because they are being fitted into categories that don't really fit them, and everyone is a special case in some way or another. You are removing the ways for people to communicate with the decision-making system, and you are setting up all of the conditions for pretty much exactly the polycrisis that followed, in my view. Bringing this back to planning, my love, and infrastructure, you can see how these things all end up as cybernetic problems. I've got, these are some of the diagrams that I drew when I was researching a paper which called The Problem Factory for the Niskanen Institute, which I did a version of for the UK. Unfortunately, shortly after I published it, the think tank I was working with got involved in an unrelated scandal and changed its name, so it's no longer on the website. I can send you a copy if you need one. I was trying to understand why things don't get built. And the reason why things don't get built in the UK has very little to do with building things. The UK is somewhat more expensive and somewhat slower than Europe when it comes to building infrastructure. That's actually a more difficult thing to establish than you'd think, because the UK does have the disadvantage of having to build almost all of its infrastructure in crowded places where people live. Spanish railway builders, I always say, get a really great reputation for the same reason that Spanish football teams do, which is that they are great at running up the score against uncompetitive opposition. Even given that, the Anglosphere, which is to say us, the Australians, Americans and the Canadians, do worse than countries with a different legal and government tradition when it comes to building infrastructure. And that cost disadvantage of the Anglosphere is all in the pre-construction phase. It's not actually in building, laying track, kind of laying cable, building wind farms or whatever. It's all in the permissioning process, and in particular in the consultation by litigation model that the common law countries seem to operate on. And these are all really cybernetic problems of the design of information architecture. So on the top right there, I have what I call the tree of disappearing information, where you just have the variety of the environment filtered through consultant reports Those consultant reports go to the consultancy firm's client, which is the developer, and then the developer communicates with the permissioning authority through exactly that kind of communication channel I was talking beforehand, one where everyone is talking in writing for the benefit of the public record and in the anticipation of future litigation. One thing that's not on that diagram is that the planning authority is also generally understaffed itself. It has, as well as the bandwidth in the communication channels, it has extremely limited capacity to process the information that it's receiving, and these days it tends to be staffed by junior people, people who are probably 5 to 10 years inexperienced relative to the job that they are doing, and people who are worried about their future careers. People in that position make risk-averse decisions, and they try to avoid and delay decisions when they can. This is one of the reasons why it takes so long to get anything done in the UK. We can kind of contrast, and this is how I ended up, my diagnosis, as it were, of the system of Anglosphere versus European infrastructure planning. There is so much more overlap and so much more consultation in the European system. In France, which beats the UK on pretty much every category of infrastructure except school building, they're better than us at railways, power, hospitals, prisons, like nuclear power stations, obviously. But reason for that is that in France they have something called the Conseil National de Débat Public, the CNDP, which has a central staff of a couple of dozen and about 300 consultant employees spread out across the territories of France, which does nothing other than carry out public consultations. It is an arm of the state which is involved before the planning process starts to talk to people and to understand what local priorities are in the areas where they're trying to build some infrastructure. It's a high bandwidth communication. It is trusted, and it is able to communicate informally and without the shadow of litigation with both the developers and the state. And this is why they get things done so much better. They've actually invested in that capability and in those communication channels to build consent and to provide for the kind of feedback links that we kind of feel like we need. It's not cheap, but bad decisions are also extremely expensive. So I'm kind of coming up to time, and I want to let everyone have a couple of cups of coffee before you start firing back at me. So this is the slimmed down, dumbed down version of management cybernetics, which I'm kind of proposing for use with British and Anglosphere governance systems. I think it's a bit of a pipe dream to think that we can completely redesign anything in the British civil service. I think it's possibly a realistic ambition to start pushing public choice economics and the new public management out of the door. I think there's now a consensus building that that really has had its time and that the world is just too complicated to manage it with Chicago price theory and commodities anymore. So this is my kind of guess at 3 principles to replace the kind of axioms of public choice that I suggested earlier in the presentation. First, that state organisations have to have enough cognitive capacity to represent the variety of whatever they're administrating. And that might mean that you have to reorganize, develop a new specialist team, or push things down to a devolved level of governance where that kind of variety matching is respected. Second, and I think this is probably the important one in terms of the dysfunctions in the British state at the moment, boundaries within and between organisations need to be treated with respect, effectively. You have to have boundaries within organisations because that is how you divide and conquer the problems. But every time you're creating the boundary, you need to budget for the communication between those organisations. In particular, adversarial boundaries should be avoided as much as possible. You know, one of the things that I keep on suggesting whenever I kind of talk to people in the inside in policy is that they are much too scared of secondments from industry. They are much too scared of allowing informal relationships to build up between their people and people on the outside. Everyone's worried about hypothetical regulatory capture and corruption, you know, which is certainly a possibility in some areas, but in general, I think people are focusing and target fixating on that risk and not seeing the greater problem of nothing happening because everything is in the shadow of the law. And then finally, administration needs to be delegated to a level where it is possible to have exactly that granular representation and to have those communication links which allow the decisions to be made with at least some kind of human ownership. Over-centralisation is really, in my view, what created the unaccountability machine, and so some form of devolution ends up being pretty much the only way of taming it. And I'm at, we're at 10:25 there. We've got time for a few, yeah, going back at me now.
It's interesting with your third law about the notion of devolvement. When it's likely to be in the gift or the control of an organisation whose senior leadership's professional organisation calls itself the First Division Association, and therefore tells them what they think about the rest of us.
I think, yeah, I mean, you know, this is one of the big homeostatic forces of the British civil service and of other kind of things. There are things that can be done. Careerism is one of the most powerful forces in the world. It's strange actually that I know this because I've been doing research on it for another book for the last year. Everyone knows what career risk is. Everyone in a room kind of will generally know which decision is favoured by the career risk factor. If you ever want to sound smart at the end of a meeting, you can say something like, of course, career risk is very important here. And everyone will go, oh, yes, it is. And go, gosh, he's wise. We all know about it, but career risk is completely under-theorised. There is no sociological theory of career risk as far that I was able to find, and it was not for want of trying. There is basically no political science theory of career risk. There is one very good book about it by a political scientist called Chris Hood called The Blame Game, but it was not followed up on hardly at all. There is one economic theory of career risk, because career risk is incredibly well studied and well understood in just one industry, that industry being fund management, because it can be shown that people who manage investment funds are very, very cowardly when it comes to departing from a benchmark. You know, they might have very strong views about whether kind of SpaceX is going to the moon or whether some other company, Microsoft, is going to go bust in 6 months. But these very strong views are only ever expressed in tiny deviations from the benchmark because the fund manager has all of their eggs in one basket. They know that they might get a bonus if they do really well, but they will be fired if they do really badly. If they do quite well, then they'll still get a bonus. It might not be as big, but it'll still be decent. If they do quite badly, then it's probably not going to be worth anyone's while to fire them. And so as a result, there is this small, ongoing minor fraud on the investing public that you pay hefty money for the services of extremely intelligent fund managers, and then they manage your money such that you might as well put most of it in an index fund. That's the career risk factor which everyone knows about, and everyone knows that it's important in that one tiny area. The career risk and the management of career risk on the part of the First Division Association, or on the part of almost any other employee anywhere in the economy, is completely under-theorised. I think there are things you can do with career management for those people. That's why one of the things that I've always been trying to suggest is something like what Malcolm Sparrow at Harvard University calls problem-oriented regulation, which is that rather than structuring things around things like health or transport or kind of issues that are going to last forever, you build the administration around problems. You have a kind of more general sort of pool of first division talent that is expected to be organised in teams shaped around a particular problem to work on understanding and developing solutions to that problem, solving it, and then the team disbands. Having temporary, short-lived organisations means you get rid of some of that bias against risk, and having things organised around problems means that you can suit the level of granularity of representation of the problem to the actual complexity and existence of the problem. Now, it's not a solution for everything. Even Sparrow thinks it's probably unlikely that many organisations could devote more than maybe 20% of their resources to problem-oriented teams. But I think that kind of problem-oriented approach and devolution on a problem basis, rather than just devolution in the sense of geographical areas, might be one way that you can get people's careerist tendencies to work maybe in a slightly more positive direction.
I asked this as a question, not rhetorical, because I don't know very much myself. But in terms of problem-oriented organisations, the closest thing that I can think of is charities that are set up for a specific problem, for a specific issue. But I don't hear a lot about charities devolving once they've achieved their aim. They usually find a new way to expand their existing aim to re-justify their existence.
That does happen. There are charities that do wind up. To be honest, many of them that do wind up do so because they were involved with the maintenance of a particular physical asset or the spending of a particular pot of money. But where you're absolutely right, of course, is in the American philanthropy industrial complex. If you ever have the opportunity to get involved with American foundations as funding research, it is... I worked in Swiss banking for 10 years. I thought I knew arrogant rich people. Then I met people working for foundations, my word. There are one or two rich people in America who decide to do good with their money by choosing causes themselves and giving money to established organisations or by funding research at universities. These people are regarded as weirdos and eccentrics because the socially normal thing to do in American wealth management and philanthropy is to employ a number of people to give away your money for you. It creates an organisational culture which really reproduces all of the bad aspects of state funding of research, is my perception. And these organisations do tend to take on a life of their own. They do tend to, in particular, develop exactly those risk aversion characteristics, particularly with respect to anything that might reduce the long-term sustainability or the indefinite sustainability of their endowments. It is a problem for charities, it's a problem for foundations. I mean, it's a problem for any kind of organisation. I've focused here on governance because I've been working with it for the last year, but I don't want to give the impression that I think the private sector has solved these problems either. I don't think they have.
Thank you.
Should we grab a coffee and then...
I would love to grab a coffee right now.
Yeah. Well,